This is a Stitch Sampler Randomizer Blanket. A lot of people wanted to know the kind of like detailed information on how I put it together. So I'm going to try and put all of this in one video. And then if you want more information, you can just ask the questions below and I will try and answer them as best as I can. So first for this blanket, I used Big Twist value in the color, I believe it's called Light Rose. I wanted to make sure I had a yarn that would be able to wash and dry pretty easily because it's a gift. When I'm giving someone a gift, I don't want to give them a chore. And I use a 5mm hook for this. I find that it works good with this yarn and a blanket and all of kind of the stitches that I have on the randomizer wheel. I like to do a counts of 5 for Stitch Sampler blankets. I find that like counts of 5 work with most of the stitches, and even if it doesn't work, it's easy to like fudge the numbers at the end. So for instance, if a stitch calls for like a count of 4, I just add a single crochet kind of on the end of the row, and then you're going to put a border on this blanket anyways. This is an arcade stitch border. The tutorial for the arcade stitch is coming very, very soon, the next day or two, so look for that. So yeah, just count. I did a count of 200. It's a good size. You can see in my original video, like it's a good size, like couch lap blanket. Some like rules when you're doing a blanket like this, you want to make sure you're doing a stitch count every couple of rows, every like 3 or 4 rows, depending on the complexity of the stitch that you did. You're going to want to do a stitch count and make sure that you're still at your total of, let's say, 200. And if you're off, do a row of single crochet or half double crochet, and you can kind of sneak in an increase or decrease or two to get you back to that 200 count. Again, you're putting on a border, so if you're off by a stitch or two for like a row, I promise you are not going to notice, and the person that you're potentially giving this to is not going to notice. I did this in one color. Obviously, you can do this in multicolor. The one color really does create it as kind of a celebration of texture. But if you look like on my profile picture, you can see an example of a time that I did this in a multicolor. I actually have tutorials for most of the stitches that are on the wheel in my profile somewhere, either in my Crochet 101 series, or I have a whole set of stitch tutorials from when I did a Stitch Sampler cardigan series. So you can look for those there. The arcade stitch will be one of the last that's missing from like the tutorials. Sometimes there is a little bit of like a figuring out how to get from one row to the next. Like for instance, when you do a row of the alligator stitch or crocodile stitch, dragon stitch, whatever you want to call it, these guys, there is kind of not a neat row of chains on the top. So what I do is I literally fold the blanket into quarters, put a stitch marker at each of the, like marking each of the quarters, and I know that by the time that I get from this stitch marker to the stitch marker, I have to put in 50 stitches just right into it. Remember, anything's a chain if you believe in yourself. If you have any questions about like how to get to specific stitches or any stitch tutorials I don't have that you would like, let me know and I'm happy to put those together. The last thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you where the Stitch Sampler wheel is and how I use it. So you're going to start by chaining your, let's call it 201 because you want 200 working stitches. I like to start it with a row of single crochet just so you have a good like base foundation to work off of, and then you're going to open up your Stitch Sampler wheel. And you can find that here. You're going to go on my profile, you're going to go in my link tree, and this is where all the Shea Yarn associated links are. And the stitch wheel that I'm using for this particular blanket is the Stitch Sampler Wheel 3.0, so right at the top there. This is what mine looks like. You can obviously make your own stitch sampler wheel if you are interested, but you're just gonna, every time you get to the end of a stitch set, you're just going to hit that spin button and spin the wheel. And I believe there are 30 different options and probably like 20 different stitches because there's some like combinations, 1 or 2 rows of each stitch. And you can see here we rolled the V stitch. So you would do a row of V stitches, and when you reach the end of it, you can spin your wheel again. And this time you will get the arcade stitch. And yeah, it's a really fun project to work on. If you just get bored easily with doing the same thing over and over again, you're never going to get bored with this blanket because you're always going to have some new stitch to do. It's a great way to learn new stitches. And like I said, putting together your own with all of your favorite stitches, puzzling out how to make the stitches work is a fun thing, but feel free to use mine. I love when I can help people by making these silly little wheels and things.